Just a minute, and it looks like we are
It is Jeff. It's just about to start.
yeah, it's showing that it has started. So let me welcome the crowd and introduce Rebecca Rundell, who's going to be talking about snails in a very interesting setting. So take it away, Rebecca.
Okay. Okay. Oops. I realized I didn't have myself on the first slide. Okay. Can you see my slide okay, Don?
Yep, looks good.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much to PRI for inviting me to give this talk. It's something I've wanted to talk about for a while now. And thanks to all of you that are spending your evening with me. I hope I will not disappoint you. And there should be some time for questions at the end. So I look forward to talking to all of you. Um, I wanted to mention before I get started, there's another QR code for you there on the title page, and I'll also put it at the end. And this will link you to the companion exhibit about island land snails that is a physical exhibit at PRI, but you can also learn a lot more online as well. So feel free to check that out if you get really excited about land snails by the end of this. So before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge where I stand and my own perspective, since I'm going to be talking a lot about Palau and the Western Pacific and Micronesia, and I am not Micronesian myself, but I feel I have a responsibility to share what I've been learning from Micronesia since about 2003 when I started working there. And this is a picture of me when I was a kid, standing in front of the Capitol. I'm the taller one there, standing with my sister. So you might think, okay, why land snails? Why islands? That seems pretty obscure. How did you come from New York State and then end up all the way out here? What got you interested in this? So what I'm so excited about in the Pacific is the number of islands, the amount of isolation, the fact that these islands were never attached to any mainland, and it's really far to get out there. So that means that propagules rarely make it out to these isolated islands. But once they're there, some of these groups diversify spectacularly. They evolve into all these interesting species. And one of the quintessential examples of this is in the Hawaiian Islands, where we get these Hawaiian honey creepers that only occur in Hawaii. And, oh, huh, okay. Sorry, just trying to advance there. They only occur in Hawaii, and they all evolved from this humble rosefinch ancestor that got blown off course over there to the Hawaiian Islands. And from this initial event, we get the evolution of all of these interesting bill types that match with different types of ecologies, different food types. And you can see here all these examples of interesting birds that have evolved from this single ancestor. So I got really interested in that sort of thing, that explosive evolution that we see on islands. And that's what drew me to want to study it. So we're going to leave Hawaii behind now. Hawaii is a great example because we know a lot about it, but we know a lot less about Micronesia, and especially this archipelago called Palau, which I've indicated with a star there. It's located out in the Western Pacific between the Philippines and New Guinea. And I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about Palau and especially just one island within that archipelago. So you might be familiar with the term the South Pacific, and I think in the US we often just vaguely refer to any islands in the Pacific that are tropical and really beautiful. as the South Pacific. But if you look at the equator there, physically speaking, Palau isn't really in the South Pacific at all. It's actually 7 degrees north latitude. But us sort of colonial people tend to think about things from our own perspective, whether we're in the US or Japan. And interestingly, both folks in the US and Japan think of these islands as the South Seas. And this has evoked a lot of romantic views of what these islands are like. And many of those romantic views are actually true because they are quite beautiful. So today I'm going to be focusing on Micronesia, not Polynesia, which is a little bit better known, includes Hawaii, New Zealand, Tahiti from the musical South Pacific, etc. So we're going to be thinking about Micronesia, which from a Japanese perspective was also considered the South Seas or the South Pacific. Palau is very tiny and very isolated, and that's part of what drew me to it as an evolutionary biologist, because I thought, hey, there might be a lot of interesting snails here. And I started looking at museum collections, and I discovered that indeed there are a lot of snails there, and I was wondering what else I could find out and learn about them. So this little diagram shows the location of Palau and just a first impression of how many islands there are, over 500 islands. And most of the islands are limestone karst. So this is like almost like an English muffin of rocks. So a lot of nooks and crannies. And if we go down to Peleliu, which is the island I'm going to focus most on today, that is composed entirely of limestone. Very poor soils and almost an ancient reef that has been turned into rock. And now people can live on it, and snails too. Just to give you an idea of how small Palau is, if you drove from Binghamton to Syracuse, that's basically the span of the main archipelago. What's kind of cool about that is the elevation that you will encounter in that drive from Binghamton, New York to Syracuse, New York, is a lot greater elevational difference than you see in Palau. Palau is pretty low elevation, and it's all covered by lowland tropical rainforest. That also drew me to it because there's enough intact rainforest there to make me think, okay, there might be a lot of cool snails here. So very tiny archipelago. And also I want to note that the island I'll focus most on today, the island of Peleliu, is only about 5 square miles in area. And I'm going to talk for a long time tonight about that island, and I could talk for hours and hours more, despite the fact that it's so small. And that gives you a sense of how much diversity there is in this archipelago. So I think there's about 150 land snail species in Palau, and that number keeps sort of moving around because we keep finding new species, and species that we thought were the same turn out to be 2 or 3 different species, which makes it a very intriguing place to work. One of the sort of curious things that I encountered when I got to Palau was that we couldn't find the Palauan word for snail, for land snail at least. There was a Japanese word that was being used, katatsumori, but we had to kind of explore to figure out what the Palauan word for land snail is, and there's a funny story behind it. But the word nyatamakla basically means something that is slow and it licks as it goes. So you can have a chuckle about that and ask me about it later. So these nyatamakla, they have diversified to an amazing degree. There are many, many species, and just in this one family, the Diplomatinidae, you could just see all the entries here in this phylogenetic tree, all these lines for the most part, are all different species. So if you compare that to the Hawaiian honeycreeper example that I showed you a moment ago, you'll get the sense, okay, there's a lot of diversification in land snails. They evolve like crazy. And part of that likely has to do with this fun fact that you all already know about land snails, and that is that they don't move around an awful lot. They can move, they reproduce, and they expand their ranges and so forth, but they don't move around like birds or bats. They tend to stay put, and that isolation helps to fuel their diversification. So, bottom line for this slide is basically there's a lot of snails in Palau, and almost all of them are endemic. They live nowhere else but Palau. So when you think about Palau, maybe you've Googled it. I hope you have. That's a very fun thing to do. You might see some images of islands like this. And these are all pictures that I took so on a non-rainy day. And believe me, it really does look like this. It's quite beautiful. But it's also maybe best known for its spectacular diving and coral reefs. And this just gives you a glimpse of that. So it's a great place to work. Even if you're working in the forest, you fall in the water, you might accidentally see some extraordinary things. The tropics, I also like to mention, people are sometimes surprised because it seems like a very calm environment. It can also be very challenging. And these are a few of the things. Of course, Palau has saltwater crocodiles and venomous sea snakes. The one that I tend to encounter the most in terms of hazards is the poison tree, the tongata. You can ask me about that later. That's my nemesis. But in general, the worst aspects of it are the most potentially life-threatening aspects of a place like Palau and tropical islands is the hot sun, the rugged landscape, and the very changeable ocean. And so people have adapted to be able to live with these really intense challenges. If we think about Palau not just as a beautiful natural environment, but as a place that people live, of course, it's a modern place and it has a very long, complicated colonial history, some of which I'm going to get into today because it's really relevant to the land snail surveys. Palau is independent. It's an independent country, but we have a special relationship with the United States. And that also means that many folks in Micronesia and including Palau serve in the US military, and they also pay the price for serving in our military. So there's quite a degree of patriotism in Palau and Micronesia that many Americans are probably not aware of. Palauans are also not just involved in those sorts of things, but deeply involved in conservation. And they realize how important that is because the land is so closely tied to their survival and their culture as people. And so, a big part of what I do and what my lab group does and what my field assistants over the years have helped me to do is to gather data for use in conservation that these folks in Palau can use to apply to their land. Palau has also been leading the way in the Pacific and really in the world in terms of its own conservation. It has one of the largest national marine sanctuaries in the world, a shark sanctuary that made big news more than 10 years ago, a protected areas network. And if you visit Palau, you will get a stamp in your passport called the Palau Pledge, which gives you a series of thoughts and things to think about as you're touring Palau in terms of having a very light footprint on the land. So all of this is based on a long cultural history of conservation in Palau. So for me, as an evolutionary biologist and a conservation biologist, it's a great place to work because I have a real partnership. If we think to how these folks got there and developed this incredible culture, one of the important things to remember is how big and intimidating the Pacific Ocean is, and what a huge part of our globe the Pacific is. We tend to think of islands as pretty obscure little places that we might be lucky enough to visit someday. Um, but it's really a big part of Earth. And it's quite impressive, I think, that people have pioneered navigation techniques to be able to make it all the way out there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Palau culture before we get into the heavy duty land snail stuff. So Micronesians may have been the original navigators in the Pacific, and they invented a type of star compass, which is important to this navigation and finding land, because obviously humans live on land. They need land to survive. And so this technology was something that was invented by them thousands of years ago and resulted in Micronesians finding land and developing societies there. And some of this navigation, especially inter-island navigation in the archipelago, is still ongoing. Of course, a lot of it happens with motorized boats now, but there's still an important tradition of canoe building that's being passed down. And these canoes were an important part of the economy in traditional Palau as well. Canoes were always built by another village, and so chiefs from one village would get together and choose a master craftsman from another village and commission him to start the building of these specialized canoes. And so, in this way, the culture had reinforced social ties as well as economic ties. And interestingly, the people of Peleliu were well known for crafting sails from pandanus. And of course, today that seafaring nature still continues, and knowing how to navigate the difficult currents, tides, weather within the Palau Lagoon is highly valued, and it's been incredibly important, especially for land snail surveys, I will say. Boat drivers are incredibly valuable people in Palau. Um, just to also give you a sense about aspects of the culture, I can tell you that there's infinite words for things like fish that are so central to the culture. And so this is a language that's developed over thousands of years in Palau, over 3,000 years. And it shows it because even within one species of fish, there are multiple words for the different life stages and so forth. So if we sort of turn to the women's responsibilities and expertise, that is very much tied to the land and taro farming, which was vital for the survival of people and is also very difficult work. So you're either out in a canoe in the beautiful crystal clear waters, or you're waist deep in a taro patch. I don't know which you'd choose, but both are very important. And taro patches are incredibly important as not just a garden to grow food, but they're really considered a treasured heirloom that would be passed down within your family. So these taro patches were incredibly valuable, and the smaller the island that you live on, such as Peleliu, the more vital and important and valued those taro patches are. Another emblem of Palau society are the bai. These are meeting houses, and each village would have at least one of these, if not multiples of them. And this is a quintessential Palau thing that I just couldn't resist showing you. These are built with specific trees for the different parts of the bai. And again, master builders from different villages would be asked to build these bai, and the chiefs would meet together and decide on the payments and so forth. So a really central part of the Palau culture. Artwork, of course, very important, but much of this was functional. I'm showing you here a couple pieces as well that are considered the women's money. So Palau is a matrilineal society, so they hold the most valuable money, such as the tuluk, the turtle shell, and the bead money. Okay, and I hope you're enjoying this. I couldn't resist showing you a little bit of Palau culture because it really gives a foundation for the scientific work as well. So if we fast forward a little bit to the first European contact, uh, that happened in about 1783 with a shipwreck. And I wanted to share this story because there was a friendship that developed between the Palauans and the English sea captain and his crew. And they were able to communicate with one another. And the son of the high chief ended up, once they had rebuilt their ship, he ended up traveling to England and as a sort of early cultural exchange. It's a really extraordinary story. And his statue is there in front of the community college. Unfortunately, he succumbed to smallpox after 5 months. So this was a big issue for Pacific Islanders, of course, that hadn't had many outside contacts. They didn't have resistance to these diseases, and so it really reduced population sizes as more colonists came to these islands. And this money jar here is an example of some of the extraordinary Palauan artwork, um, some of which still continues today. So eventually, as seafaring increased across the Pacific among Europeans, colonialism started to occur on many of these islands, and that includes Palau, first by Spain and then by Germany. And I'm not going to go into great detail about the German occupation, but I did want to mention the mining that was involved there because it's quite relevant to the land snails. Because these phosphate mines created big gouges in the land, it also polluted the land. And in the case of the German colonial effort, they also introduced a monkey. There's no native monkeys in Palau. And so this crab-eating macaque is still established there, and it's started to move around to different islands. And unfortunately, it eats native birds and also Palauans' food. So it's just one of the many examples of introduced species. And if you look at the online exhibit about land snails that I posted the QR code for, you can read all about rats and all sorts of invasive species that affect the native wildlife. So following from German colonialism, Japan took over Palau initially as a commercial asset. And this is relevant to any terrestrial species because of the modifications of land that occurred with the huge number of Japanese people, as well as imported laborers from Okinawa and Korea that came over to help build this South Seas empire that the Japanese were building. Uh, the Japanese administration, which was called Nanyō-chō, that's the Japanese government, or the South Seas Empire, was especially interested in the protected harbors that Palau provided. And eventually, those became military assets for Japan and its impressive navy. You'll see on the right there, there's an abandoned bauxite mine, so aluminum mining that occurred in the Japanese administration. So they were looking for mineral resources that would also help to build their empire. Shifting gears now to Palau, or to Peleliu, this southern island within the archipelago. This is what I'm going to spend the rest of the time focusing on. And this has kind of been something that we started working on with my first field assistants when I was a graduate student at University of Chicago. My first trip to Peleliu with now Dr. Anne-Marie Gowell, who's now a conservation scientist herself. And we explored this island and were confronted with all sorts of curiosities that have taken me over 20 years to start to untangle and figure out. So this is a very tiny island, but you can see how mostly flat it is. That means it's a great place to build an airstrip. So that's going to come into play here as we get going. But importantly, even in this early Japanese administration, there were several villages, in fact, 5 different villages within this small area. And believe it or not, even though there was such a small area, people for the most part stayed within their own village and they needed permission to kind of move between villages. So there's a strict organization of land ownership and just as a very organized society that's occurring on Peleliu at this time in the early 1900s. So as the Japanese administration became more and more established, they surveyed the phosphate areas within this island, and they decided to start phosphate mining in earnest here on this island. And that started a trajectory of changes that really started to change the land. It also displaced people from some of the most valuable farming areas on the whole island, which also disrupted the culture significantly because the chiefs and the people of these villages derived a lot of their power from the quality of those farming areas. But many of those were sacrificed for the sake of mining phosphate and getting fertilizer from that to send back to Japan, the mother country. And many Peleliu citizens were involved in this as well. Were asked to be involved and eventually more like forced to be involved. But while this is all going on, still the culture proceeds sort of as normal with an overlay of Japanese rules and language. And many of the older Palauans still speak a lot of Japanese because that was the main language for a long time, as well as Palauan. Palauan is still widely spoken. I wanted to share with you a few photos I found of Palau before some of the most massive changes occurred. This is an example of a Palauan house and an odasongo, which is the stone platform. Some of these were foundations for houses, but also ceremonies would occur on them, and some of them were used for burial. I just wanted to make the point here that even though this is an island and we're talking about seafaring people that are fishing for part of their livelihood, the land is central to everything in Palauan culture. And interviews with some Palauans in this early period indicate that their lives depended on the land, that land was more than a commodity. It was part of families, and the control of it basically dictated everything about being Palauan. So you'll see how much disruption occurred when that land was destroyed, as we'll see that a lot of it was modified greatly. Fortunately, there's some surviving photographs. This is a really special one, I think, because the Otasongla, the stone platform on which this bai was built, is one of the few remaining historical structures from this time period, from the early 1900s, that still survives on the island. And this is a picture that was taken by somebody who studies mollusks that did early surveys there that I'll talk about in a moment. So this person's name was Yoshio Kondo, or Yoshi for short, and he was a very special person. He studied land snails, and he started out basically working as a deckhand on a steamship aboard a Bishop Museum expedition in Hawaii. And the curator at the time saw how talented he was and started to mentor him. So eventually, Yoshio Kondo received his PhD from Harvard, and he led an expedition to Palau through the Micronesian expedition. And this was very fortunate for me. Of course, he didn't realize that, but it was very fortunate because he collected the baseline data for the island of Peleliu and the Palau archipelago before World War II. And so obviously a lot of land modifications happened during World War II. So this baseline data is invaluable. So all of the collections that he made are like treasures, basically. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time is sort of the island of Peleliu and comparing what we see now to what Dr. Kondo found all those years back in 1936. So he was born in Hawaii, but he spoke Japanese. He had Japanese ancestry. So this was very valuable for visiting Palau, where Japanese was widely spoken. And of course, there were thousands of Japanese people that lived there. So his specialty was partulid tree snails. And these are almost like the dolphins of the snail world. They're the charismatic snails of Oceania, and they're incredibly diverse. There's at least 120 species, but they're also some of the most endangered land snails. So Kondo was looking for these especially because he wanted to do his research on these. So he did widespread surveys, but he also was looking for these species. So the three chief species that have been documented from Palau, Partula thetis, Calypso, and Leucotho, would be the main ones that he would have been seeking to find on Peleliu. So what did he find? He found many dead partulid shells, which is pretty interesting that even at that time there was probably enough habitat disruption that there were some populations that were becoming extirpated. However, he did find two living species, Thetis and Leucotho, which is quite interesting, as we'll see. And he found over 43 species. And I'm going to keep this kind of vague because he probably found more species than 43, but many of them are unidentified. So this is kind of my ongoing work to figure out all the species that he found because some of them are just very cryptic and difficult to identify. And he was focused more on the partulids. So that's 1936. He visits Palau and he collects all of these specimens that are now housed at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, Hawaii. Around this time and a few years after that, military pressure started to build. And the military presence on Peleliu increased greatly. And Lieutenant Colonel Nakagawa was tasked with defending this island. And so the people of Peleliu started to feel that pressure, and their cultural practices were disrupted as they were conscripted to be involved in helping protect and defend this island for the sake of the empire that they were a part of. So at this time, because Peleliu was flat enough to potentially have an airstrip, they started building one. And they didn't have bulldozers or any equipment like that. They built it with shovels and picks by hand. And forced laborers were brought to do that, as well as islanders. And the airstrip, as you see it here, has now been also added to by Americans after the war. But this was a really important asset for them, and it's what drew the US attention to this island as well, because obviously during the war, this would be a major strategic asset. And some of you that know a lot about World War II probably have a lot of thoughts on this. And I'm going to give you sort of the short Islander centric kind of version of this, but just be aware, I've got a stack of about 20 different books about World War II stuff, so we could talk for hours, but I'll give you the speedy version. So the airstrip was under construction. Two villages were displaced. They just had to find somewhere else to live on the island, which was very difficult for them. And in the meantime, more islanders were brought to help dig caves. So there was an existing cave system, and the Japanese government wanted to improve upon that. And we still see evidence of the shovels and the picks in the caves themselves, which hold all sorts of remains of war and artillery and all sorts of things as well. So the idea here was to slow US progress in the war, not necessarily to win, but to slow the US down in trying to capture this potential strategic asset. During this time, the US was bombing Peleliu and the archipelago by air and by sea, and the Peleliu people were still living there. And I mention this in part because obviously that affected the land in terms of bombs being dropped and the effects on the forest of this. And you can see the quote here. I think it sums it up. The people were terrified. The people of Peleliu were terrified of what was going to happen to their home. So by August of 1944, the Japanese people forced them to vacate their island, and some of them had to live on the rock islands, which was very difficult, and the remainder all went to the northern largest island of Babalab, as you can see by these arrows here. Even though Palau is such a small archipelago, it would have been very unusual for people of Peleliu to ever visit up there. So they were really in a foreign land. They spoke the same language, but many of them didn't have clan ties up there. They also didn't have time to pack any food to go up there. So the chiefs within the states of this largest island of Babildab um, decided what villages they would be able to go to, and they chose villages that had large taro patches that could support them. But all of this time, the US is still bombing the islands, so it's quite a frightening time. And the elders of this time that were interviewed in the early 2000s speak of the hardships that they survived there. They couldn't go fishing very much because it was so dangerous. They could potentially be bombed at this time. So this is all this war talk isn't, you came for snails. I know that's what you want to hear the most about. But this is all really relevant because it sets a stage for what is about to happen to the land here. So the Japanese military has figured out this strategy to defend the island from the high point, which is what early Palauans would have done when they were warring between other islands and so forth. But the difference is they had guns and all manner of landmines, barbed wire, and so forth. So they set things up to make things quite difficult for the invading American troops that would come. And this is relevant for my land snail work because this is the area that's most important for the land snail diversity. And so part of what we're trying to do is to reconstruct the land changes over time and how that affected the diversity of species in this area, which is now more of a conservation area. So some of you that have read about World War II might be familiar with some of these areas, such as orange and white beaches. This is an area within the southwest of Peleliu where the American Marines 1st Division invaded. And the Japanese forces had set up landmines, but there were also a lot of natural hazards that the Marines weren't prepared for, in part because of some potential errors in Navy surveillance leading up to this battle. And so the limestone, rugged nature of Palau, and especially Peleliu, which is so important for land snails, is a very hellacious place to do battle. And if you've read anything about the Battle of Peleliu, you have some idea of this. So the beautiful coral reefs, the fishing grounds, all of the areas that the people of Peleliu cherished for their livelihood became obstacles in war. And we still see the hallmarks of this activity to this day and the changes that occurred to the shore as well as the island itself. And when we do field work there, we see evidence of this war everywhere that you go. There's just an untold quantity of grenades and machine guns and all sorts of things, flamethrowers and things, and you can see what the forests look like as a result of the American strategy, which was to try to basically kill the enemy, and it was very difficult because of this intricate network of caves. And so defoliating the forest with flamethrowers and napalm was the strategy there. And it the environment became very difficult for forces on both sides. And there's so much written about this that I don't think I need to say much about it other than to say that it wasn't just the landscape, but the heat, the humidity that really took a toll on the troops here. So the environment was really seen as an impediment and a very different idea from what I described previously. And when we're doing our land snail surveys, these are just some pictures I've taken. So just a huge amount of the war is still there, is still present on the island, and has been for decades. You can see here, I have so many photos of this that I really had to, believe it or not, I really edited this down. There's a lot to see here. So by the end of this conflict, which was thought it would only take 3 or 4 days, took more than 30 days and resulted in the deaths of over 10,000 Japanese troops and over 1,600 US troops, and many more wounded and also captive. And across the island, there are many reminders that you run into in the middle of the forest, a mossy plaque, um, reminders of memorials of the war, and multiple perspectives on this. And the people of Peleliu have just sort of allowed this to happen. And these days, fewer and fewer people visit because unfortunately that generation has started to pass away. But the memory is still alive here with these many memorials from the Japanese as well as Americans. So when it comes to the land, you can imagine that a huge impact was made in terms of the shape of the land, as well as the pollution of it, and also the potential danger to any islanders walking around there. You can see those little markers there, the white and red markers. There's been a recent effort, maybe in the past 10 years or so, to do demining and sort of remove some of this very unstable ordinance and for the safety of people walking around. But it's it's almost impossible to remove it all. There's so much, and I just made a list here. And some of you folks that are very astute in military kind of things will know what some of these things mean from your perspective. Let's just say a lot of things. And the islanders' impression when they eventually arrived back to their island a couple years later was a barren landscape that was just bright white from the white phosphorus that the Americans had basically expelled onto the island to help defoliate it. Okay, I realize I'm taking a lot of time here, so I appreciate your patience. Okay, snails. So now we're back in the 2000s, and I'm looking at Yoshi Kondo's museum collections, and fortunately, he's left behind this amazing map. And so what we've tried to do is retrace his localities and start to make some comparisons with the snail diversity that he found there, and then look after all of this devastation occurred, after the war, what species we have left. And this is still an ongoing work, but it's quite interesting given everything that happened to the island. So one of the focal points for me is this area called Bloody Nose Ridge, where some of the most fierce fighting occurred. You might be familiar with the Point, Wildcat Bowl, those sorts of historical places. White and Orange Beach are the places that the Americans originally came up onto the island, and those two villages were destroyed. Um, but we've basically done surveys across the island to see what's there, especially in the sort of red circle area. Here I am with one of my grad students. We camped on Orange Beach, which is one of the invasion beaches, which has now been repatriated to the destroyed village of Telluride. And Diane Tickell, who let us camp there. And they've also hosted many Marines that will come back there to explore. And believe it or not, after all of that defoliation and fighting on these islands, there is a lush rainforest there. It's just a different rainforest. More invasive species, a different suite of species than there were previously, but there's still a forest. And that's quite interesting from a snail perspective as to what still exists there. So we surveyed in multiple habitats, including leaf litter, limestone karst that you see here. And collecting specimens is really important to this work because many species are difficult to identify. So a photo is not enough. You need to collect as well. And so I've now been back with different sets of students and field assistants about 6 or 7 times, and we are accumulating data on this place. It's a beautiful place to work, but you also have to watch your step and not fall into a giant karst hole. Here, my student is posing for me next to this pit of limestone here. And we also run across the remnants of war while we're doing this work. And interestingly, we have found so far about 51 land snails, most of which are endemic to the Palau archipelago. None of them, as far as I can tell, are endemic to Peleliu alone, but they're all Palau endemics. And it includes species that we tend to find in the most pristine forests, which tells us something about the health of the forests that exist in Peleliu and possibly the rate of regrowth of that forest following a lot of deforestation during the war. So it's a pretty exciting to find some of these species. And so we worked with the Palau Conservation Society to document what is there and potentially to protect it. One conspicuous absence from the island are some of the tree snails, the partulid tree snails I mentioned before that Yoshi Kondo worked so diligently on. So in his time in 1936, he documented live Partula thetis, which still occurs elsewhere in the archipelago. It's endangered, but it still occurs. He also found Partula leucotho, and that species is critically endangered and potentially extinct, and I would lean towards it's probably extinct. So during our surveys, we found neither of those. Which unfortunately makes some sense because these are both tree-dwelling species. They live on emergent vegetation. They don't live in the ground. And so they probably had a more difficult time surviving during the war when so much of the island was defoliated. And unfortunately, partulids around the Pacific are quite imperiled, and especially in Micronesia. So it's unfortunate that they no longer exist on Peleliu. However, Partula thetis does survive on a few other islands in the archipelago today. So with these data, we were able to work with Palau Conservation Society, who worked with the landowners of this area known as Bloody Nose Ridge. which was the site of some of the most violent parts of the war. And this area is now set aside as a forest of hope. And we continue to document native species there, including birds and a native frog that lives there. But I'm quite proud that snails are included on the list of some of the important species there that previously the government of Peleliu did not know about. So it's really exciting. And this is our group in 2018 with Lolita Gibbons Derong from Palau Conservation Society. So she's supporting this work, and we're very grateful for her leadership. So I'm almost done, just a couple more slides. So, and I thank you so much for your patience. This is Peleliu today. It's being rebuilt. The culture is still surviving, but in a different form than it was before the war. I just find the sign striking that despite everything that's happened on this island, that the people of Peleliu are still saying, please come again. We want you to visit and we appreciate you. It's quite striking given the difficult history of this island. Of course, World War II is still omnipresent across the islands, and it presents danger to islanders. All this unexploded ordnance, grenades, and so forth. So I think we have to take some responsibility for everything that happened there. Despite the positive outcome from our perspective, perhaps, we still have lingering remnants of the war on these islands. And in the midst of this, Palauans themselves are controlling and conserving their lands, and I have great hope for some of the emerging conservation scientists there. Heather and Augusta here I've just highlighted. So I just want to thank you all for your attention. This is kind of a new talk that I was really excited to share with you. So I appreciate your attention. And if you're interested in Palau, want to learn more, I've just made a short list of a few books you might want to check out. And I would also encourage you to check out the online exhibit on island snails to learn more if you would like. And thank you again. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was great. And we'll open it up for questions. Some applause from Rob there. I can start off with one, and that is that I haven't thought very much about the ecology of war, I guess, is maybe a way to put it. And it makes me wonder what, and I also know nothing about the ecology of the Gaza Strip, but I assume it's all gone pretty much. And I don't know if you've thought about that when you see news of war in some place. Are you thinking about lessons learned from here that go to other places in the world and in conflict?
Yeah, I think when the first time I worked in Palau with my field assistants, Anne-Marie Gowell and Chris Carroll, when I was much younger and just starting out, and found things like grenades and shells and all sorts of things scattered around on the ground. And having come from also working in Hawaii, where there's a great deal of unexploded ordnance, I think the profound reality of the pollution of the land and the danger to the people that live there and the kids that are playing there and the people that are trying to farm there. I think about the landmines that are being redeployed and reset around the world, Ukraine, and also what we've left behind in Southeast Asia and other places. So I really support any demining efforts and just awareness around, um, without arguing whether a war is important or needed and just staying out of that side of it, the way that we engage in war and what we leave behind and the responsibility for people not to lose their arms and legs and things like that. That's what I think about. Not to be,
Mm.
I know that's like the
Yeah.
saddest thing to talk about, but it's really important.
Right. And there's a question in the chat from Jim Long. The title slide shows you wearing a headlamp. Did you do much of your survey work at night?
Oh, yeah. Rarely, just because of the danger of falling in a hole or falling off something. A lot of the snails are likely active at night, but Palau is so rainy and wet that we tend to not have to work at night. But we often will wear a headlamp just because it can be so dark in the forest, especially when it's really overcast. And the snails are so tiny, and especially around like the entrances of caves and just underneath the canopy of the forest, it can be so dark that a headlamp really helps you to see what's there even during the day. So sometimes we go out at night and it's fun to do that, but I tend to just do that in places where it's near a beach and I know that there's not a lot of holes that we could fall into. Um, so it's not really necessary to do field work at night for snails. For some other things like frogs, it's good to go out at night. They're more active then, but for snails on Palau, it's not as necessary. That's a great question. Thank you.
And a question from our first speaker of the fall, Marla asks, in addition to the invasive species you mentioned, are giant African land snails, I'm not going to try and pronounce that among them. So she put in the Latin name there. I know they've driven other Partula species to extinction on other islands, unfortunately.
So there are giant African land snails in Palau. They were probably introduced. I mean, it's a complicated question to answer, but they definitely became more abundant during the Japanese time. I think they were used as food. We don't find live ones back in the forest very often. We tend to find old shells. The giant African land snail, of course, is a vegetarian. It tends to be more of a crop pest. The real problem is the Euglandina rosea, the rosy wolf snail, and also a flatworm called Platydemus. So both of those are introduced and they both occur in Palau, but we don't find them very much at all. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a Euglandina in Palau, which is weird because we've been collecting there for a long time. So, but there's still threats, it's still something that I educate people about. So, short answer to your question is yes, there's giant African land snails. They don't seem to be a problem in the native rainforest. And there's also these invaders that could become, if they were to expand, they could become a huge problem for the partula tree snails. Um,
And
and
there
thank you, Marla. Nice to hear from you, Marla. Thank you for coming.
Thank
and
you, Rebecca. Great
Mm.
talk.
Um, and I missed a question before, Marlis, from Sarah Allen. Great talk. Very interesting. You mentioned a poison tree in the forest. Coming from a botany background, is it, all these Latin names, Semicarpus venenosa in the Anacra, or something else?
Mm.
Yeah, I think I can't remember the species name exactly, but yeah, it's a relative of mangoes, I believe. And the Palauan name is Tongata. And basically it it has kind of a black sap. And you would think I could identify it very well, but it looks very similar to other trees, and also leaf litter dwelling land snails like it. And it also lives near waterfalls, which is also a good place to look for snails. So I've tangled with it quite a bit, and it's kind of like a poison ivy times 10. Um, it creates some havoc on your system and itching and rashes, and yeah. So I'm increasingly allergic to it, so I try to avoid it, but I also like to roll around in the leaves to look for snails. So I know Marla can relate to that. So it's a danger. It's more of a danger to me than saltwater crocodiles or anything like that.
And a question from Shelley Page. How do you collect and preserve the live snails?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. We will, when we survey an area, we're not just vacuuming up every snail there. We will decide on uh, every, every 500 meters or something, sample in a sort of boundary area and do timed collections. And we'll collect what we find there in different ecological categories, and then we'll bring it back to our little makeshift lab at night, and then I will preserve those specimens in ethanol. And that seems to be the best way in order to be able to get DNA from them and ensure their long-term accessibility for the next 200 years for other people to look at them. Um, and it's also most convenient for being able to ship them to where we need to for further study. So they're meant to be a permanent record, or as permanent as possible, of what's there. And as you've seen, there's been so many changes in Palau and elsewhere that it's really important to have that record preserved. Thanks for the question.
And there's another question in the chat from Timothy Pierce. Did some snail species occur in certain habitats or habitat partitioning?
Hi, Tim. Great to hear from you. I'm so pleased that you came to this talk. Uh, yes. So there are certain species that we find only on rocks, and some that we find only in leaf litter, and some that we find only near the beach, and some that we find only in trees. But then there's some others like trochomorphids, for example, that sometimes we will find under limestone karst rocks, but also on wet bark of live trees and other kinds of interesting places. So there's some snails that kind of can live in a few different habitats. But now we kind of have a sense of which ones we'll tend to find where. So usually the snails that live on rocks tend to not be leaf litter dwelling as much, but there is, some of them will do both, especially in places where there's a lot of leaf or limestone rubble on the ground mixed up among leaf litter. So it's hard to tell whether the snail is going after the leaf litter in the soil or the rock, because they're kind of at the interface of the two. Um, and I know Tim is one of the great experts on this topic, and so I would love to have him in Palau with me to see his insights on this as well.
And sort of related to that, snails aren't found much in the caves, I assume.
Oh yeah, so this is an interesting one. Uh, the caves. So there are a lot of caves in Palau in general because of the limestone karst landscape. The caves in Peleliu are a little bit of a special case because there can be um, things like landmines, sometimes human remains in some of the caves, and also the sort of chemistry of the water seeping through the caves tends to not be great for preservation. So we do find some dead shells in the cave. So I've collected some at the like the entrance of the caves, but for the most part, we haven't needed to really go deep into the caves because there's so many snails, living snails outside of it, and we tend to find more dead shells in the caves. That said, I would be interested in potential fossils in caves. But the folks that have worked on bird fossils on islands like Stedman and so forth haven't found great preservation in Palau caves. So it's kind of a frontier, but I guess on Peleliu, I'm a little bit more hesitant to start widespread cave exploration because there are some remains of war in some of those caves. And there isn't necessarily a strong need to go in there. But it's a very intriguing question. And military experts have studied the caves, so there's an entire book just about the caves from the perspective of the U.S. Marines. So if you want to read about caves, there's a lot to read about.
And there's a couple more questions in the chat. So Rob asks, how does the land snail fauna on Palau compare to that on other Micronesian islands?
The land snail fauna on Peleliu is quite impressive given the amount of assaults on the land there, even compared to other islands. But there aren't any Peleliu endemic species on the island. So in that way, it's slightly less extraordinary because there are some Micronesian islands that have species that are endemic to just one island. But that said, many of the species that live on Peleliu are kind of very sensitive species, like ones that are sensitive to microclimate change and also invasive species like rats eating them. So I would say it's very impressive and worthy of conservation, just given the diversity of what's there. And it's only five square miles, so it's pretty extraordinary.
It's amazing. And Mimi asks, what do snails do positively or negatively to affect the environment?
Hi, Mimi. Thanks for that question. I didn't have time to talk about that, so I appreciate the question. They are nutrient cyclers, so they're feeding on leaf litter and they're grazing on leaves and they're eating the fungus and bacteria that's living on the surface of those leaves. And they're probably pooping out a lot of spores and things. So they're kind of connecting the sort of decomposers among the leaf litter. And so that helps to break down all of that leaf litter. The other role they play is that they're food for other animals like lizards. There's a lot of endemic lizards in Palau that will eat snails and birds. So mother birds might eat snails, especially when they're doing their egg laying. So the extra calcium source from their shells might be important to many animals. So they play a very humble role, but an important one.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Go.
I see the scenes of Second World War. and I see in the pictures how Palau devastated by conflict. But my question it is how the species, in special of snails, survive to devastation in this case.
Thank you for that question because I didn't speculate on that, and it is the big looming question. The short answer is I don't know. I have talked to the few other terrestrial biologists that have worked in Palau but on other organisms. They are very surprised when I tell them that there's endemic snails there, and they're the sort of snails that wouldn't have been brought back there by humans, that they're things that survived there very likely. My best guess is that many of these species, because they're ground dwelling, they live in leaf litter and limestone karst, that there were surviving individuals that hunkered down there in these wet little pockets between all the nooks and crannies that there are in these mountains. Despite all of the flamethrowers, the napalm, all of the defoliants, and those pictures that you saw, I'm speculating that there were enough pockets that remained that they were able to then increase in abundance following the war, given that sort of quiescent period after the war when nothing was going, no one was really touching that area much at all. So we don't know for sure, but one of the things I'm trying to do is using the surviving photographs to reconstruct what areas those refer to and figure out where some of those surviving pockets might have been, to sort of recreate that. But it's the million-dollar question, I think. So thank you.
Okay. Other questions?
I want keep in touch with you, Rebecca, but I don't know if you have an email.
Oh, yes. I think I put it at the beginning. I can go back to the first slide. It's just my last name at esf.edu, but I'll put up the title slide here. And then I'm sure there's an easier way I could have done this, but I did it the hard way. So my website is there and email. And yeah, I'd love to hear from you.
Other questions? Well, thanks so much for the great talk. There are a couple of new comments. I put a description and Rob put in your email in the chat. And there's a thank you in there from Sarah. And for whatever mysterious reasons to me, the slide for the session 2 weeks from tonight, which is Suzanne Macy from the American Museum of Natural History, and her talk will be We Need to Conserve Biodiversity, Improving Our Teaching Will Help. And the description's there in the chat. So hopefully folks will join us 2 weeks from tonight. And thank you one and all.
Thank you. I really appreciate everyone's time. So thank you.
I very much appreciate yours. Enjoyed the talk very much. So thanks. And we will call it a night.
All right.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much.
Have a great night all. I'm going to click the end button.
Have a good night.